Welcome to 30 Minutes of Wisdom, Rising in Consciousness and Mindfulness. I'm Veronica Carrera, the creator and producer of the show. 30 Minutes of Wisdom is about rising in consciousness and connecting to our authentic self. To help us persevere through these uncertain times, we have created a space for conversations that are rooted in wisdom and higher consciousness. And today, we're going to have a very important and much needed discussion. But first, let me introduce you, out of everyone that you see here, let me introduce you to my wonderful co-host, Loni Olazaba, Director of Inclusion Recruiting at LinkedIn. Loni, so great to have you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you and with everyone. I am very equally honored to be sharing in this mindful moment regarding this very important topic. Although it has been, a heightened problem more so recently, historically, this has been an ongoing problem for Asian and Pacific Islander communities, and they've had to deal with it for a very long time. Today's topic is addressing race and violence against Asians and Pacific Islanders. Veronica, would you like to introduce our fabulous guest?
I can't wait, Loni. So we have 4 phenomenal leaders, and let me start with Jia Hang, Head of North America Marketing Solutions at LinkedIn. Welcome, Jia.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Perfect. Then we have Michelle No. She is the Vice President and Head of Client Services and Operations at Verizon Media.
Thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much, Michelle. Okay, then we have a good friend of mine, Lynn Min, psychotherapist and CEO of Soul Matters.
Hey so guys, it's going to be fun.
Yes, absolutely. And last but not least, we have David Song Hong, author and podcaster. So great to have everyone today.
Excited to be here.
No, perfect. Thank you so much. So for the audience who's watching, thank you for being here. We are going to have a phenomenal discussion. Please post your comments, your questions, and we'll try to answer them live. Recent attacks on Asian and Pacific Islander victims are at the center of a national dialogue about anti-Asian and Asian American racism. Although this has been a problem for this last year in terms of the coronavirus, historically, going even farther is always been a problem that the Asian and Pacific Islander community has had to deal with. So with this said, let me ask the first question. What is your opinion on the root cause for the violence against the Asian and Pacific Islander communities? If I may address the question to Michelle and Jia.
Thank you, Veronica. So, I think anti-Asian racism isn't a new topic, right? It's not a new phenomenon. It didn't just start with COVID-19 and the coronavirus. It's been around for many, many, many years. But I think what we're seeing is the microaggressions have also been there, and anti-racism kind of sentiments around in movies and TV shows and in Hollywood literature, et cetera, has been there for a very long time. But I think last year, with some of our previous leaders calling it the Kung flu or the China virus, plus the kind of political environment in the United States, and adding there the social media, the ability to kind of post some of these attacks, I really think that's where we're seeing kind of an uptick in violence getting represented, although it's been there for some time. I think it's just being shown more now, and mainstream media is picking it up because of the social media presence. So, we're just seeing the attacks more. I think they've been there for some time.
Yeah, I would echo so much of what Michelle touched upon. Racism against Asian Americans is not a new phenomenon. Absolutely. In fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was, the most hard-coded systemic way to represent racism in this country, that legislative action was taken in the 1800s. And so for hundreds of years, this has been the experience of Asian Americans in this country. Mm-hmm. And if you ask any Asian American about their personal experience, they'll tell you the big and small ways that they've experienced racism and in many cases violence throughout their lives. I think what is new, as Michelle said, is really the brazen ways in which some people feel empowered to inflict violence. And certainly some of the rhetoric around the origins of the coronavirus, that certainly doesn't help. And what's really new, though, is the number of people speaking up and speaking. And so there's a broader awareness of what's going on, what's been going on, and certainly a lot more media coverage around it. But I'm personally a little bit exhausted from talking about it. I'm tired of feeling threatened. I'm tired of feeling unsafe and angry and frustrated. And I've been thinking a lot about what is my role in this, and both in terms of how we got here and me being a member of this society. What responsibilities do I have? Where do we go from here? And I know we're going to have a lot more conversation about that in the minutes to come. But, I think we're all sort of collectively in a place where we've been through this journey of, there's been much, much heightened awareness. There's been a reckoning. We've all kind of traveled through the cycle of, shock and then dismay and frustration and anger. And I think we're sort of all collectively moving toward, what do we do next? And how do we evolve from here?
Yeah, so well said, Gia. I couldn't agree more. And Michelle and Gia, you both mentioned, that it's clear that in this era, we now have more visibility into the hate and the violence that happens in our societies through, social media, telephones, cameras, and whatnot. I actually see this as a double-edged sword, in that we have proof now to demand justice, which is a great step in the right direction. But we also share in the painful reality of how often these crimes are committed and how they're being committed. Would love to touch on the unreported crimes against Asians and Pacific Islanders, and why do we think anti-Asian hate incidents often go unreported, and what can we do about it? Lynn Davidson, would love to hear from you.
David, did you want to say? Oh, yeah, sure. I'll go. I think there's something to the Asian culture where, long suffering and silent suffering is really honored. And, this idea that we don't speak out first, but we first process inwardly, is a huge value. It's part of the honor system, and not speaking. It's like, I was always taught, if you don't have anything good to say, then don't say it at all. Right. Right. And so I think it's part of, we're taught these things, and I think it's like the flip side of the coin, right? It's not always like, I'm trying also, as I'm dealing with this, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like I kind of also kind of bring to light of how I've been processing too. I was also kind of like, why am I not angry outwardly, or why am I not, outwardly so outraged, and why am I not moved, for justice? And it doesn't mean that I don't care. And sometimes it just turns inward, and it turns into shame. Like, oh, I must be emoting wrong. But I think there is a gem that Asians are not taught to emote that way. Yeah. And we've always kind of lived with this the tension of what we should be and how we should process and what that should mean and what that should look like. It should look like anger. And if we're angry, we should have these outbursts, right? But no, I was taught, I remember just a dichotomy of second grade, when my teacher would be saying something to me, and I was an ESL, and I don't know what she was saying, but I know it was something like I should have done better. And she turned my cheek around and she said, look at me when I speak to you. And then, junior high school, when dad's yelling at me, I'm looking at him just to let him know I'm listening. I got it. You can stop yelling now. Right. And he's like, how dare you look at me, be so bold. Right. And my whole life was about just kind of grappling with these tensions. And so, the way that I was intrinsically taught to deal with conflict and how public I should be with it and how private and internal I should be with it was also something that has, recently more been in my conscious level of awareness. And just all to say, I think this is why one of the reasons why we don't report crimes is because, it's a shame-based culture. Mm-hmm. Shame and secrets go together. And it's an honor system that's based on that, how long suffering and how silently you can suffer and how gracefully you can suffer. Mm-hmm. And there's some beauty in that. I don't want to throw that out. And so I just wanted to mention that and also encourage everybody who's trying to deal with it and going, why don't I do this? Why don't I do that? So many social media stuff have caused some anxiety in me. Why am I not as angry? Mm-hmm. But just to give yourself some space to emote in the way that you emote. And, I appreciate Gia saying, I'm really tired and exhausted. And where do we go from here? Like, how do we process this in the way that we were taught, also honoring the ways that we were taught?
Yeah, I love it. The resilience is absolutely beautiful as well. Something to celebrate. I appreciate that mention. Davidson, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. As my mom was a refugee from Vietnam, I know Michelle is Vietnamese as well, and it's quite common in our culture to, like Lynn was saying, just to be resilient. Just because when you've gone through the war, our grandparents and my mom has seen so much death that you kind of become jaded to a lot of this because you're just so used to it growing up. So even as a defense mechanism for me, even though there's been hundreds of microaggressions and sometimes I feel alone, you kind of just learn to deal with it because it can be. That's why when a lot of people reached out to me during the Atlanta shootings, it brought up a lot of memories, a lot of trauma from the past, 25 years, right? Like even as a young child, I was so used to, you just become so used to it that, I get it. People mean well. They're curious about like what my thoughts are and things like that. But like Gia was saying, it can be exhausting to explain to everyone and kind of have to bring up all these traumatic moments. And I reached out to some folks just as a way of healing myself, to kind of share like, hey, that wasn't okay. Like what you said to me and what you've done and how you made me feel. And of course they respond by saying, oh, I'm offended. I'm a good person. I would never make you feel that way. Right. So, I was looking on the website, there's been 3,795 AAPI hate crimes, right? Just in the last year. And a lot of it goes unreported, right? Because we're so used to it that you kind of just become jaded. It's not even worth your energy to report it, right? And for people that English isn't their first language, they probably have no way of reporting it anyways. So,
or they don't know how to navigate the system, right? Fear of what happens if I report it. Is there going to be any retaliation? And part of it is how we navigate our own internal culture, right? So, Gia or Michelle, anything else that you would like to add?
Absolutely. What Lynn and Davidson both said really resonated with me. I think we've all learned to compartmentalize and kind of suppress some of those memories and that pain from whether it was childhood, whether lunchbox moments, or getting asked where you really from, which has happened to me countless times. I think that this is the first time I think our generation has really kind of had to deal with it head on. Right. I think we have all experienced microaggressions like we talked about, but, with the attacks in Atlanta, with, the attacks that we're seeing in New York and other places, where it's actually bringing up some of these memories we've worked so hard to suppress. And I think that's been really difficult and really exhausting. I think a lot of people have even suppressed their journeys and their stories, and, those should be celebrated, not kind of forgotten. I have friends who've had their names changed from Asian names to American names because it was just easier to kind of assimilate. They weren't taught the language, etc. So, I think as an Asian community, we've actually dealt with a lot of pain. And I think we've all just learned to kind of put it away and kind of move on with our lives and, be taught, put your head down, just do, get good grades, do hard, work hard, get a good job. And, kind of, it's kind of your price of admission, right? To be here. So I would say, I think why it goes unreported, I think Davidson said a part of it's language, part of it's culture. I think sometimes we wrestle inside with, is it really worth talking about? Is it really that important? Or can I just kind of, push it away and push it out and just kind of move on like we always have?
I think this is a good opportunity. Thank you, Michelle, to talk about the culture, right? Let's talk about the Asian and Pacific Islander culture and how they have dealt with racism. And Gia, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, Sunday night, the 93rd Oscars was a special moment in my household for a number of reasons. I mean, I think, representation matters. Representation in the kind of content we consume in media, the movies, the shows, the way we see Asians portrayed in the stories that we want to see and read. is so important. So at that superficial level, it was an important thing that we had, a Best Picture nominee be a film about an Asian American immigrant story and the struggles and struggles of an immigrant family. And when that happened, what was particularly encouraging to me was just the outpouring of support and connections that people drew to their own lives, people who are not part of the Asian American community, saying, I understand that at a human level.
Yes.
And what that highlighted for me was the fact that there's just not enough connection points where we understand each other as people. Chloe Zhao mentioned in her acceptance speech at winning the Best Director Oscar, and I'm going to paraphrase what she said, but she essentially said, people are not born evil, right? It's the way we're socialized, the way we're educated, the media we consume in this country that really limits our ability to have truly diverse perspectives and appreciation for people and cultures other than those who look like us. It doesn't matter if it's Asians or Latinx or the Black community. I think we sort of share that kind of common frustration and limitation in the way that we're socialized. And in the case of non-Asian Americans, what most people see and hear about are caricatures of Asians and the outputs of a model minority myth, which basically says that Asians are high achieving, Asians are good at math but not good at sports or the arts, and Asians are not victims of racism and violence because they experienced and enjoy some level of economic prosperity relative to other minority groups. And in that vein, both our triumphs and our tribulations in the form of the violence and the racism that we experience, those stories go completely untold.
Yes.
Because there's a very dominant narrative about who Asian Americans are and how they live. And so we become these caricatures. And when you distill people down to caricatures and you don't see enough of the stories of their human lives, it's so much easier to spit on them, to yell at them, to marginalize them. There was a recent Axios poll that found that 64% of Asian Americans have at some point been asked, what country are you really from? Because you're not American. Where are you really from? You live here, but where are you really from? And, that's a microaggression where, that's probably one that's fairly unique to Asians and Latinx immigrants, where for the rest of your life, no matter how many generations you've been here, you will be asked where you're really from. Because the general societal understanding of who we are is that we are not part of the fabric of the history and the culture and the society of this country. And I think that's something that, as a generation, we can very actively work to correct and fix.
Yeah, what you just said really impacted me personally in a powerful way. So thank you for saying this, for sharing this. And I heard Lynn going, yes, as you were speaking. So Lynn, I want to give you the opportunity to share what's coming to you.
Yeah, I so resonate. Just to, when Veronica, when you asked the question about what is the culture that kind of like helps us, or like what sets us up to deal with this in the way that we're dealing with it, I think we have to just kind of admit and kind of see the both ends of this, the coin, the good and the bad of our coping mechanisms, which was repression, right, minimization, and what else was there? Like, suppression, and they've worked. And a part of the piece that I've written, like a blog that I've written, it was just really about digging deep and kind of like, this isn't new, but why is it hitting us now? Maybe it's also an internal call, right, to our own like old defense mechanisms of how we have survived isn't working. And part of that, there's like the good that like we can celebrate, and we have successful Asian Americans, but also there's so much pain that was not dealt with, like even in my own home. And Gia, when you say about like we don't know, like we haven't really developed those connections, I mean, I don't even need to go far like and talk about fetishes, about people in spas, or like I don't even know my own father sometimes. He's a role. He's the guy that married my mom. He came to America first. He brings home the money, or he's supposed to, or whatever. And, they work really hard, but I don't know like his feelings. He's not humanized to me. And so I think just, even starting from us, I think it was a huge wake up call, and processing the way that Asians process, like, what does it mean to me first? How did I play a role in this? I started to realize, this is like also an internal call to recognize that, part of our survival mechanism was this belief in white supremacy, right? Coming from my background, I was brought up Christian, and I was in a Korean American immigrant church. And so whiteness to me, just in such subconscious levels, were like the people who brought God, the people who saved us from Japanese oppression, the people who saved us from people who look like us, and so deep in our collective subconscious is like, of course it's better. That's what we're achieving to be. And so in this moment when it's like called out and it's like, you have white privilege, or like that, it's like, I don't know how to emote, because whoa, like that, like I've worked so hard to go after this thing. And now like I felt really exposed kind of thing. But I think in that sense, it's like a huge collective, like, wow, there's some really, really beautiful ways that we have coped, and some really kind of flawed ways that now that we know, there's other ways that we need to shift as a collective unit, and how can we start more like talking about it more? How can we, from the family unit, start humanizing mom and dad? And, how can we get over the language barriers and the generational gaps? Because if it doesn't start from the collective home, it's really hard to work with the collective, like, like people. And so, yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Lynn. I would love to give some time to Davidson, just to ask you the same question. How, let's talk about the Asian and Pacific Islander culture and how they have dealt with racism. Just to remind you of the question, can you share some additional thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, because I think even within the Asian culture, there's different hierarchies, right? Michelle and I being of Vietnamese descent, we're lower on the Asian totem pole, right? The darker skin you are typically means that it's from a lower socioeconomic background, right? So growing up, I even saw that, Koreans and other like higher class Asians would look down upon me, right? And you can feel the energy in the room, right? Sometimes it's unspoken, sometimes it's blatantly obvious, sometimes it's oh, you don't look Vietnamese, I thought you were Korean, So I think we have a lot of work to do as a cultural collective. But yeah, I do think it's interesting, because a lot of my Vietnamese friends, like a lot of us don't have fathers, right? We haven't had role models, right? And because of the intergenerational trauma from the war, it gets passed on from generation to generation. So, I can't fault my father for not being around, because he never had a father being around, right? And then in Vietnam, it was more social, it was more accepted for the male figure to kind of roam around and almost be unfaithful, right? Because of how society is back in the day. So it's, once you dig deeper into the intergenerational trauma, it gets pretty complex. But, so sometimes you don't know where it's coming from, but you just know it does affect our generation. And there's a lot of healing that we all have to do as a collective.
Yeah.
And Michelle, you're probably, I would love to hear your thoughts as well in regards to this. But I feel like there is a lot to process in regards to our own dynamics within our own culture, and how do we process this to learn how to stand up for ourselves with what's happening to our communities. But Michelle, some additional thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Davidson put it really well. I mean, there are so many different cultures and people that make up the Asian community. I think it's 200 different countries that are considered Asian, thousands of languages. It's really hard, I think, to consider us a unified community when there's that much disparity in kind of just who we are. And Davidson, when you were talking about the Asian totem pole, I mean, that's something I've certainly experienced in my lifetime. So, I think that's where we're going to have to do some work as a community is really come together as one and really kind of start to put those differences and cultural gaps aside and really unify and strategize and organize, right? So I think, overcoming our fear of just not speaking up, I think that's just kind of innate to most Asians. Is, like I said earlier, just kind of put it aside and not say anything because it's probably easier to do it that way, and don't bring attention and trouble, don't cause trouble, all those things. I think we need to start putting that aside and really overcoming that. And organizing and being loud and speaking up and moving past just posting on social media and, donating or donating your time, volunteer, leverage the skills and powers that you have to help the collective.
Yeah. And Loni, I think this takes us to, Michelle kind of transition us to our last question, which is powerful and we want to leave the audience with, but go ahead, Loni.
Yeah, I know, it's awesome. And Davidson, I'm going to give you a little, a saying that us Black and brown folks say, and it is, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. Throw that out there.
I like that one, Loni. I like that.
I was the lighter skinned one, but it's real true. And Gia, I love your mention of, the stigmas and the caricatures. I think that is so real. And I even know it in my own family and culture to be so true. And so that bringing the human factor back, is so important. But yeah, Michelle, what you said is so strong. And so the last question is really about how do we take our voices back? And, I know we're going into Asian and Pacific Islander American Heritage Month. And I believe the theme is celebrating resilience and voice and lifting our voices. And I'm so excited to share this with everyone. So, Gia, would love to start with you. How do we take our power back as a community?
Yeah, a few things. So we touched upon sort of these like cultural undertones of honor and shame, of maintaining honor through not talking about shameful things. And I think that there's actually another cultural undertone that we have to actively embrace as part of how we come out of this, which is sense of duty to the community and a sense of duty and honor to myself. Personally, for my entire life, I shied away from labeling myself or drawing attention to myself for my race or my gender. Because I just wanted to be noted as exceptional for my accomplishments. But in doing so, and in accepting the things that were directed at me or directed at people like me as just a part of the package, I've condoned it in silence. And shame is allowing those things to perpetuate because I'm condoning those actions, and in some ways, supporting it by not speaking out and speaking up. And so, for me, a big part of this, it's not just about the Asian American community. I think that all of us have a duty and a responsibility as human citizens to commit to being anti-racist long term. And that's a really big term, and there's a lot that goes into that. And as previously mentioned, there's an element of this which is being just a friend and checking in. There's an element of this which is about speaking up and speaking out. There's an element of this which is about donating your time and your resources to organizations that are actively doing more work systemically. But being committed to being an anti-racist and being an ally to everyone long term is continuing self-education and continuing advocacy as a person. And in my profession in advertising, it's continuing to tell stories. Telling the stories that connect us to each other as humans, and celebrating and committing to humanizing each other and humanizing myself, truthfully, not as a stereotype or a caricature, but as a human being of triumphs and tribulations. And that's something that I would love to see all of us sort of committing to. It's just fundamentally being anti-racist as humans.
So well said. So well said. Lynn, your perspective?
That resonates so much. Thank you so much. And I would also say, in taking back our power, I think just to honor the hurts and the atrocities that's going on, and to grieve with those who are grieving, but not stay there. energy begets energy. And when we come from a space where we're fearful, any kind of action will lead to more things that we're just like, we perpetuate this. And to that, I think self-awareness is huge. I always say, it's not like, are we racist or not? All of us are, because that's how we make sense out of things, right? We group things, and we're all kind of stereotypical, and like we all make meaning out of grouping things together. But it's how aware are we? How racist are we? And how much awareness is there? And what are we doing to always kind of leave room for the complexities and the nuances of people? And we do that exactly by, like what Gia said, tell stories and humanize first, lead with your humanity. And I leave people with that, don't stay in the hypervigilant zone. Yes, things are happening, but things have always happened, and not to like put your blinders on, but to see them, but to come to a space of, and nevertheless, we are resilient people. Yes. And how do we continue and voicing and just being and living as, not people who are afraid, not people who are victim mentalityed, but something more. We can tell a different story and a different narrative.
Yeah, lead with your humanity. I love that so much, Michelle. So well done. Davison, you got a little words there to throw at someone if they talk about you being a little brown or the other, but how else can we take back the power as a community?
Yeah, I think it's not just speaking up and not being afraid to share your voice. It doesn't matter your title, what your background is, if you're an executive, right? It takes courage to speak, right? And sometimes we think that our voice doesn't matter, but even if you just impact one person, that's one person that might be curious in buying a book and learning about the Latinx experience or the Black experience or the Asian experience, right? I know it's not always easy, and pace yourself, right? Like you don't have to buy 200 biographies tomorrow, but just incorporate it into your daily practice. And I think if we're curious about each other and different experiences and respect each other, that's how we'll have more meaningful change. But it starts with the inner self before we can truly impact at a macro scale.
Yeah, that's right. Very well said, Davison. And Len, what superpower can you leave us with?
Well,
I think it's Michelle.
Oh, I'm sorry, Michelle. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I mean, everything that everyone has said is really resonating with me. I would say, that we have a duty to ourselves, to the community, to the world, to our children, right? I mean, my hope is that my kids don't have to have this conversation 20 years from now. That is my deepest hope, right? And so I think it is education. It is speaking up for ourselves. It is, like Lynn said, dealing with some of these pains right now so that we can move through them into action. And, I think there's a cultural shift that needs to happen for the Asian community. So that's something I think we all have to commit to and be responsible for and do it together.
So true. This is a calling. And this is a calling for all of us to stand up and speak for each other and for all of humanity. I believe that that's the underlining statement, to leave everyone with. And then having us go into Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, celebrating that resilience and uplifting voices, knowing that as people, we have the capacity to care for more than just one group, to be allies for each other and to support each other. So thank you so much. I'm personally so grateful for this experience with all of you. And Miss Veronica, thank you again for having me as a co-host with you and for the awesomeness you're doing with these mindfulness moments.
It is my honor, Loni, and I want to thank the speakers today. You have honored us with your presence, with your wisdom, with your energy. And for the audience, thank you so much for making the time to be here. This was probably one of the most important discussions that we have had during the show. And so post your comments. So we will go back and read them and answer them. And thank you again. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Take care.